The dove that locates the site of the sanctuary of the ram's fleece shows up in a different way. While Jason, travelling in the Argo on his way to find the fleece in the Greek myth, let forth a dove in order to get through the clashing rocks, Noah, travelling in the Ark, was informed by a dove of the first land to rise above the flood, namely Mount Ararat. The Greek equivalent of Noah, Deucalion, landed his ship on the mountain of the aforementioned Dodona when the waters of the Great Flood started to subside. Of course, in Egypt, the flood was an annual occurrence, and because it occurred upstream at the Upper Egyptian capital at Thebes 5 days earlier than downstream at the Lower Egyptian capital at Memphis, those downstream in Lower Egypt had a chance to prepare if they had forewarning, and were very keen to hear the news from upstream in Upper Egypt about when the waters had started to rise or to subside. When the first flooded fields started to appear from the subsiding waters, the farmers needed to prepare for the season of sowing, known as Peret, emergence. This event was embodied in the Egyptian myth of the emergence of the primordial mound from the waters of creation. The communication by carrier pigeon from Upper Egypt of the start of Peret is of course the origin of the motif in the Noah story of the dove informing Noah that the first mountain had emerged from the flood waters. In the case of Ararat, the floods in question were more likely to be those of the Euphrates. The Noah story is derived from much older stories found in the epics of the Mesopotamian region, where the pigeon had been domesticated 5,000 years ago. One of the sources of the Euphrates is the Murat River, which rises close to Ararat. The Euphrates, like the Nile, is a river that flooded quite regularly, and advance warning was very useful both for agricultural preparations and for health and safety. And the flooding of the Euphrates is mainly caused by the spring melting of snow at its sources. It seems very likely then that Noah released the dove as part of a flood early warning system for the Mesopotamian civilization that lived on the banks of the Euphrates, so that farmers knew when to lead their families and animals to safety. Particular mountains close to the oracle centres became associated with the primordial mound, and Thebes had the mountain they called Mistress of the West. There wasn't a mountain at Avebury, so they built a representation of the primordial mound. The visiting Egyptians could easily have learnt from the locals that on this well-drained chalkland you needed to dig down to the water table for a reliable water source, and that this water table rose annually in late winter. Hence some of the streams here only flow in winter, such as the aptly named Winterbourne stream that passes near Silbury. The water table here is thought to have been higher in that period than it is now. They may therefore have realised that by digging down over an extended low-lying area, they could create a space that would, like the Nile, flood once a year. By putting the removed soil and chalk produced from creating this sacred periodic lake all in one spot within this area, they would simultaneously be able to create an image of the primordial mound standing above it as if rising out of these waters. Even today, the flat area around the base of Silbury floods quite regularly, even though the water table is now lower. For Egyptians, this annual flooding would definitely have been seen as being infused with the same cosmic principle which caused the Nile to flood, even though it happened at a different time of year. And just as in Egypt the time of growth followed the receding of the floodwaters, in the chalklands the water table tends to be highest in late winter, and so it is likewise after the floods have receded that we see the time of growth, in this case being spring and summer. To recap, we've seen that it seems likely that carrier pigeons were released from Thebes in Upper Egypt at significant times in the Nile cycle in order to share the news at great speed, and that later this same news became of interest to cult centres beyond Egypt that timed their festivals in a similar way. An oracle centre was also established at Delphi in Greece. Indeed, this became the most important Greek oracle centre in the ancient world. The site is located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, a mountain which, as mentioned, is on the latitude line halfway between Thebes and Avebury, in other words, at 3/7 of the way from equator to pole, another of these seventh divisions. This was the other mountain, along with that of Dodona, that claimed to be the place where Deucalion brought his boat when the flood began to subside. And although it wasn't said to have been found by a dove, it was found by birds, for it was said that Zeus wanted to find the centre of the world, so he released two eagles from the ends of the earth, and they met at this site. The birds were presumably changed to eagles because the Greeks saw these as the birds of Zeus.